Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 11, A Nation on the Move, Westward Expansion. Today, we're going to be talking about the years 1800 to 1860. So, we're going to be going right into the Civil War, and then for the next few weeks, we'll actually be doing the same thing over and over to look at all the kind of different angles that get us to the Civil War. So, we're going to start here today with Westward Expansion, moving west. And we're going to look at three things today: the Lewis and Clark expedition, Missouri Crisis, and the Mexican American War. So starting off with Lewis and Clark here, here they are right here. They are two explorers and scientists that are employed by Jefferson to go ahead and start scouting out the places that he bought from Napoleon during the Louisiana Purchase. So Lewis and Clark will go and scout out the entire area of the Louisiana Purchase. They'll find the Western Passage or the Northwest Pass, excuse me. Um, they'll find the Pacific Ocean. And they'll find and scout out the Mississippi River, the whole valley, and all majority of the western states. So they're very important, and they are very important as well with our building up our Native American relations during this time. This is the whole scope of their expedition here. So you'll see at the top, boundary not determined. This is the current boundary, the current border of the United States and Canada up here. That's not pictured. But at this time, we're kind of in dispute with Canada. We haven't really drawn out and figured out our borders. So that's why it's like kind of hazy. We don't really know how much territory we have out here. But everything in purple here is what we buy from France, from Napoleon, as part of the Louisiana Purchase. And so Lewis and Clark will initially start here in Washington, D.C. prior to their expedition and then make their way over all the way to as western of the United States as you can get before they officially switch over in St. Louis and start going around here to explore some things. Now, keep in mind that during this time here, this area around the Mississippi River is populated. There are cities here and there are settlements here, but it's French settlements at this time. And so they're not in complete wilderness while they're right here next to the Mississippi River. But as they continue getting west and west and west, they're going to be encountering things for the first time. And sometimes they'll be the first people, the first Western people that the Native Americans out here are encountering ever. Um, so you'll see it's a very long trek. Remember, this is not on a highway. This is not on a, printed or punched out trail. This is like in the woods, very primitive hiking. And they've got a lot of people with them and a lot of equipment with them as well. And you'll see we have death of Sergeant Floyd here. There'll be a lot of problems, a lot of illness, a lot of sickness, a lot of death on this because you just have so many people and such a unfamiliar and really not easy, really difficult journey that you're embarking on here. So they'll continue on through here. They'll encounter the Sioux Nation here and then continue. And then this is where we get into they're just going out and exploring at this point. Somewhere along the lines here, they do end up with Sacagawea. She's a Native American woman who will eventually follow them and guide them through some of the different areas up here and be their interpreter when they encounter other Native American people. They'll go all the way to find the Northwest Pass here. So that's to get to the Pacific Ocean. And they'll get here, see the Pacific Ocean, and then bring it all that news, all of that back with them to Washington, D.C. And they'll go over and backtrack and try out different routes for this area because this is all kind of new. And then eventually they'll follow their same return path here. So very long expedition. It takes them 2 years, 1804 to 1806. So it's quite a long time to be walking on foot and collecting all of the necessary data and interactions that they're collecting throughout this time. Let's take a look at the Missouri Crisis. So the Missouri Crisis happens and as results with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. So, as part of the Louisiana Purchase in 1817, Missouri is gonna begin petitioning for statehood. It's the first part of that land to apply for statehood, and that's so technically Louisiana is the state first, but it is already like at capacity, like it's already a state as soon as it um uh comes into the union with the purchase. Missouri is the first one that had to organize and draw its boundaries and get its people there. They have to go through like that whole process of statehood. So they eventually get there and they do apply for it in 1817. And by 1818, a year later, thousands of settlers had decided to go to Missouri, including slaveholders who were going to bring about 10,000 enslaved people there. A year later, the House of Representatives is going to take this up, and it's going to bring forth a huge debate over whether slavery would be allowed in this new state, because we already have pretty big anti-slavery sentiments that are going around at this time. We're not fully at North versus South or abolition versus slavery, but we're headed there, and this is the first time that we really see that kind of coming to the front, especially in Congress at this time. And so politicians are going to try and avoid this whole question of slavery. And they've been doing that since we created the Constitution, and they compromised on the 3/5 clause that every slave counts for 3/5 of a white person in order to count for population only to determine the number of representatives that you have. Other than that, they didn't really care about giving enslaved people any kind of rights or even freeing them, right? And so, although slavery existed in many northern states at this time, the compromise is going to anger many northern politicians because they, when we're creating the Constitution, this is the time that we're talking about, because they're going to think that that extra 3/5 is going to favor the South unfairly, right? It'll give the South more representation in the North based on people who aren't even citizens, right? So, not necessarily because they're enslaved, but because they're giving their competition an advantage, is the idea here. And so this brings it back up again for the first time, because admitting Missouri as a slave state is going to tip over the balance of free and slave states in the Senate. And it will give the slave states two more senators than the free states have. Because so this map right here, if you ignore Maine and you ignore Missouri, because that's going to happen on the next slide, but if you take those two out, the rest of the states that remain are pretty even in the ones that are slave states down here and free states up here. And so the concern with bringing Missouri in as a state is that it's not going to be equal, that it's a problem, because then the slave states will have more control and be able to pass more pro-slave laws and things into effect. Now, if the reverse were true, if Missouri was a free state, the South would have a problem with that, because then the free states would get two more senators, and it would tip the balance in their favor. So either way, this is not a great situation for either side of the country at this time. And so what's going to happen is they're going to come to an agreement in 1820 that's called the Missouri Compromise. What will happen is that Missouri and Maine will enter the Union at the same time. Maine up here will enter as a free state, while Missouri enters as a slave state. And this keeps the balance equal between the free and the slave states, and that the Southerners don't have to fear that the North will have too many, and then vice versa, right? And that, of course, the slave owners don't have to be deprived of their property at this time, right? That was a huge concern for the people in the South, right? And so to prevent this from coming up again, because we're going to continue to add states, they decide to go further, and they say that each time a territory applies for statehood, it depends on where they are that determines if they will be free or slave. So that line is the 3630 latitude line, which is right here in red, and it's the southern border of Missouri. And essentially, the idea is that it's going to cut in half the rest of this Louisiana Purchase territory. Now, if you look at this, it's not much of a compromise, right? Because it only leaves Arkansas for the South, but it gives the rest of this territory for the North to be free states. Now, and nevertheless, they come to this agreement, they compromise, and they say, okay, yep, that makes things easy. Slavery can exist south of this line, but it cannot exist north of it, with the exception of Missouri, because we're creating it with the ambition of making Missouri. And that's going to last for 30 years until we get to the Compromise of 1815 next time. But keep that in mind that we have these divisions already. I'm gonna go back to it for a second. We have these divisions already forming, these problems that are already coming to the surface when you have free states and slave states in the same unified country, and how you deal with admitting new people um, to configure into whatever you've got going on here. So it's not something that's going to be an easy fix for them, and it's something that they'll um, continue to struggle with as we go through the rest of this semester. And the last thing we'll talk about today is the Mexican-American War. I think, okay, yes, this is the only slide I have for this one. This is just kind of a map that shows us the entirety of westward expansion. So I'm gonna talk about that for a second before I talk about the Mexican-American War. Everything in red here is the original 13 colonies, right? And then the rest of it, it shows us when and how we get the rest of this land. In 1783, we'll get this as we continue to push westward and finish up the negotiations and different wars with people. We'll get this here. We'll purchase Louisiana territory here from France, and that doubles the size of the country overnight, right? And then eventually we'll get these Texas and then these states um, from Mexico when we finish the Mexican-American War. And then eventually we'll end up getting this Oregon country from Britain later on as well. But so you can see we expand in phases, right? We expand in phases, and we're continually pushing out our borders at every way that we can, but primarily we're moving west. The idea for the United States is that the United States is destined to control all land from the East Coast to the West Coast, right? And eventually we get there. So that's what's really driving this push westward. Now, to talk about the Mexican-American War, what happens is that President James K. Polk is elected in 1845 on an expansionist platform. He's elected because he wants to expand and increase the amount of land that the United States has. And so he believes that the US should annex Texas and take the Oregon territory from the British. So those things do happen, but not, he doesn't just say that they happen and then they happen, right? He's we fight the Mexican-American War because we do flood Texas with American citizens, and then we get mad when they're in a different country and that country tries to enforce some rules and policies. And so we stir up and lead a rebellion in Texas from the Mexican government. That'll eventually lead to Texas being the Lone Star Republic and then eventually becoming part of the United States. And so that's one of James K. Polk's. That's, check, got that one. And then the Oregon territory, eventually he will split the territory in half. After the Mexican-American War, he'll split it between Britain and Mexico. He'll get a chunk of it. But eventually he'll use some violent tactics to get all the territory that he's after and that he's looking for. And so that's how we end up being the current landmass that we are today. The textbook goes into a lot more detail about the Mexican-American War and about this expansionist of James K. Polk. So make sure you give that a read because you want to know and have that information as well. But it's pretty crazy how quickly we, in about 100 years, a little less than 100 years, we expand from just these 13 colonies all the way on the eastern seaboard to controlling the entire middle of the continent, right? And so it's a pretty big change that happens very quickly, relatively quickly. And so that will also have major implications for us next week as we continue to move closer to the Civil War. We'll see as we bring in this land and all these people, how we begin to start interacting with each other, and it doesn't always go so well. So with that, I'll leave you with lecture 11. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to email me or drop a message in our questions forum. And other than that, I'll see you back here for the next lecture.